So let's play devil's advocate here. Kell, Brook and Eddie Hearn are waking up on Sunday morning. The previous night, Kell Brook has rendered Gennady Triple G Golovkin unconscious in a dominant performance which has seen him crowned even as a unified middleweight champion. Kell Brook wakes up on Sunday morning and he's got the world at his feet. He's become one of the biggest draws in global boxing overnight. His name is on the front cover of every newspaper out there. He's being touted as the sports personality of the year. He's being touted as the pound for pound number fighter of the world. The boxing world is at his feet. He's now the unified middleweight champion. Does he want to fight the other biggest star in the game, Saul Canelo Alvarez? Does he want to fight Canelo for his various middleweight belts? Does he want to have a massive domestic pay-per-view showdown at middleweight against Chris Eubank Jr.? Does he maybe decide to bypass both Canelo and Chris Eubank Jr.? Does he think, what do those guys have to offer me? Those guys don't have a belt. Does he decide to unify? Does he decide to take on Billy Joe Saunders or Danny Jacobs in an attempt to win all the belts at £160? Surely these are all options available to Kell Brook after he puts on a devastating performance against Gennady Golovkin. Right? Wrong. Wrong. Maybe I'm late to the party here. Maybe this is something that's come out before that I've simply missed. But I've just watched an excellent interview on the Seconds Out YouTube channel. Radio Raheem, the interviewer, is interviewing Eddie Hearn. It appears to be at today's public workout to build up Gennady Golovkin and Kell Brook. And Radio Raheem, in the course of an excellent interview, asks Eddie Hearn whether there's a rematch clause for Gennady Golovkin. Now Eddie Hearn answers in a rather elusive way. He actually is so elusive with his answer. I think he says something, you can check out the interview so I won't quote him, but Radio Raheem then says, oh, so it's not a contractual thing. And Eddie Hearn has to admit that contractually, Kell Brook does have a rematch clause against Gennady Golovkin. To repeat that, Kell Brook does have a rematch clause contractually against Gennady Golovkin. Now, British boxing fans will be aware of some of the potential problems with rematch clauses by observing the Tyson Fury-Vladimir Klitschko situation. Now, I'm not for 1 second suggesting that a Kell Brook-Gennady Golovkin rematch would necessarily be as problematic, painful and complicated as a Fury-Vladimir Klitschko situation has been. But nevertheless, by having a rematch clause of this nature, you're certainly opening yourself up to some sort of risk. And it, of course, limits your options. So Kell Brook is not going to be able to jump straight from his victory against Golovkin into a mega money showdown with Chris Eubank Jr., into a unification match with Billy Joe Saunders. He's not going to be able to lure Canelo Alvarez back up to middleweight for a chance to win all his belts. If Kell Brook wants to retain those belts, he is going to have to face Gennady Golovkin in a rematch clause. Now, potentially, that's bad news for Kell Brook. Let's say Kell Brook sneaks a controversial majority decision. Is he going to be confident going into a rematch if there's some fuss about the nature of his win, if it's controversial whatsoever? Is Golovkin the biggest payday available to Kell Brook in a rematch? You know, potentially, if Kell Brook beats Golovkin with ease, which I think few would suggest he will, but let's say Kell Brook just goes out and knocks out Golovkin in the first round with a jab, potentially people will be more interested in seeing a big fight against Chris Eubank Jr. than a rematch. So what I'm getting at is a Gennady Golovkin rematch is potentially not the biggest money fight for Kell Brook, but of course Golovkin's always going to be a risk due to the quality of fighter he is. And for me, if Kell Brook was lucky to sneak a victory in this fight, whether he gets a lucky knockout, I don't know, whether Golovkin injures himself, whether Kell Brook wins by points in a very controversial fashion, if Kell Brook wins by one of those manners, if I was his promoter or manager, I wouldn't take the risk of a Golovkin rematch. I'd go for fights that I perceive as higher reward and lower risk. You know, at that point of Kell Brook's career, he should be calling the shots, he should be running the show, he should be getting Canelo over for a fight at Wembley, he should be getting Chris Eubank Jr. in an 80-20 split for a fight at Wembley. You know, those should be the options that are available to him. But unfortunately, they're not going to be available to him because the big draws for those opponents, the big draws for Billy Joe Saunders, the big draws for Canelo or Eubank Jr., at least part of it is going to be the belts on the line, the chance themselves to become unified middleweight champions. And if Kell Brook wanted to take one of those fights, he'd have to drop the belts. Now, Eddie Hearn already was laying the groundwork in this interview with Radio Raheem. And you can make your own opinion on this. The interview's online, so check it out. To my eye, Eddie Hearn was already laying the groundwork to vacate the belts if they were, if Kell Brook was to win. He said something to the effect of, yeah, we'd have to face Gennady Golovkin, but only if we decided to stay at 160. So he was already laying the groundwork maybe to move back to 154 or maybe even 147. I don't think 147 is going to be realistic for Kell Brook, having made 160 for this fight. I also think in the long run he'd prove too small at 160, even if he was to beat Golovkin. So 154 may be the sensible move, and potentially there would be fights that could be made at 154. If Liam Smith beat Canelo, for example, that would be a massive fight. Amir Khan potentially at 154 would be a big fight. But certainly the names at 154 are possibly not as big as the names at 160. I mean, Amir Khan, there's no certainty he is a 154 name at this stage. We'll wait and see what weight class he's been in. And the other guys at the top of the 154 division, Andrade, Lara, Charlo, they're certainly not the cash cows that are Alvarez, Eubank, Saunders, those guys in the 160 class for Kell Brook. So a drop down to 154 may be ideal in terms of Kell's fighting weight. That may be where his body and his size is best suited to fighting to in the long run. But it probably isn't going to be ideal in terms of generating the income he's going to need. Let's remember that Canelo has said that his fight against Liam Smith will be his last fight at 154, and he'll be stepping back up to middleweight in some catchweight or another in his next fight. So I think this is bad news for Kell Brook. I know a lot of people think I'm hating on Kell Brook. I'm actually not. I've always been a Golovkin skeptic and a Kell Brook fan. But for me, this is a bad fight for Kell Brook, and maybe I've missed out. Maybe you guys knew about this rematch clause for the last few months, but it's news to me. Maybe I'm just slow on the uptake and I didn't pick up on it. I do appreciate that voluntary challenges, which is what Golovkin has offered Kell Brook, usually come with a rematch clause. But for one reason or another, I hadn't actually picked up that there was one here. I guess the other thing to factor in is, I guess one could make the argument, and Eddie Hearn could make the argument, that if Kell Brook beat Golovkin, he's got belts at 147, he's got belts at 160, he's pound for pound number one. Potentially at that stage, Kell Brook is bigger than the belts. He doesn't need to worry about the belts. But I disagree with that argument. I really do disagree with that argument. I think if you're entering negotiations with fighters, a guy like Canelo would still perceive himself to be the A-side in a fight with Kell Brook. A guy like Miguel Cotto would still perceive himself to be the A-side in a fight with Kell Brook. But, for Kell Brook to say, look, I'm bringing 2 or 3 versions of the middleweight world title, you're bringing none, that adds a lot to a negotiation standpoint. A guy like Billy Joe Saunders, if that fight, he would be the one bringing the belt if Kell Brook was stripped of his. It affects the negotiations, it affects the marketability of the fight. I thought Kell Brook, if he beat Golovkin, would potentially unify at 160, and it certainly affects that. So, for me, this news came as a surprise. For me, it's bad news for Kell Brook, and maybe they'll do the rematch with Golovkin. Maybe Kell Brook will beat Golovkin so comfortably that people are not even surprised that, you know, not even concerned about a potential rematch. But I think that a Golovkin rematch will always be low reward, high risk. Fundamentally, if Kell goes out and knocks out Golovkin or outpoints Golovkin, at that point, it's on his record, it's on his CV. He'll get the credit for it. Does he need to do it again? You know, Golovkin's such a risky fight. If I was managing him, I'd be looking for the big money fights, which I perceive to be lower risk. The Eubanks, the Alvarezes, the Cottos. Will those be such lucrative options with this rematch clause? Let me know your thoughts. I may be overreacting. I'm surprised, but let me know your thoughts. Was this to be expected? Is this a positive? Is it a negative? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this video, if this was news to you, do hit the thumbs up button, support this channel, and if you're new, do subscribe so you can check out my other stuff in the lead up to this fight. Many thanks indeed for watching, people. Truly appreciate it.